Are your fingers numb in your right hand? Reach the fingers out that are bothering you. Now, is the pain gone?
Your only chance to survive or evacuate is to leave with us.
They promised salvation but delivered only death. From the jungles of Jonestown to the eerie silence of Heaven's Gate and the unimaginable horrors of the Ant Hill Kids, these were not just cults, they were nightmares made real. Blind devotion, twisted beliefs, and suffering beyond comprehension. This is the dark truth behind some of the most terrifying cults in history. Welcome to Sanctum Obscura. November 18, 1978. Deep in the jungles of Guyana, over 900 men, women, and children took their final breaths. Their bodies sprawled across the ground, mouths stained with the remnants of poisoned fruit punch. The air, thick with the scent of death, hummed with a lingering energy. A ghostly echo of the screams, the panic, the final, desperate moments of a community betrayed by the man they had trusted most. Jim Jones, their leader, their father, their god, watched them die before turning a gun on himself. This was not salvation. This was not revolution. This was murder. Jim Jones was a man who wrapped himself in the cloak of righteousness, preaching equality, unity, and hope. His followers believed him, drawn in by his fiery sermons and promises of a utopia where race, class, and oppression had no place. He created the People's Temple in the 1950s, a religious movement that disguised itself as a force for social justice. Jones was charismatic, his voice a mesmerizing mix of authority and warmth. He spoke of a future free from racism and poverty, a socialist paradise where the weak would be protected, the hungry would be fed, and the suffering would end. But beneath his benevolent exterior was a darkness, a man who craved power above all else. By the late 1970s, cracks in the foundation of the People's Temple had begun to show. Rumors of abuse, financial fraud, and even sexual exploitation began to surface. Former members spoke of beatings, forced labor, and manipulation. Jones didn't just demand loyalty, he owned his followers. He dictated their marriages, controlled their finances, and most disturbingly, claimed sexual rights over many of them, both men and women. Those who tried to leave were threatened, shunned, or worse. When the scrutiny from the US government intensified, Jones took his most devoted followers, over 1,000 of them, and fled to the remote jungles of Guyana. There, he built Jonestown, a settlement named in his own honor, where he promised his people they would be free from oppression. But Jonestown was no paradise. The jungle was thick, suffocating, inescapable. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter, ensuring that no one left. The days were long, filled with exhausting manual labor under the relentless sun. Food was scarce, rations strictly controlled. Meals often consisted of nothing more than rice and watery broth, while Jones and his inner circle dined on meats and delicacies smuggled in from the outside world. Malnutrition set in along with disease. Many suffered, but none dared complain. To speak against Jones was to invite punishment, public beatings, confinement in small dark pits in the ground, and in some cases, drugging with powerful sedatives. Jones had his own supply of barbiturates and amphetamines, which he used to stay awake, his paranoia growing stronger with each passing day. Jonestown operated under the voice of Jim Jones. His speeches were blasted over loudspeakers, filling the air with his words from morning to night. He ranted about the outside world, the conspiracies, the enemies closing in. He spoke of the white nights, the moments when their community would face attack. During these drills, he would order his followers to line up and drink from cups, telling them it was poisoned. only to reveal later that it was a test of loyalty. But on November 18, 1978, it was no longer a test. Concerned family members back in the US had begun pushing for an investigation. People had escaped, whispering stories of horror. Some had sent desperate letters home, begging for help. US Congressman Leo Ryan decided to take action. He flew to Guyana with journalists and aides, arriving in Jonestown on November 17. At first, it was a performance. The People's Temple put on a show, smiles, music, rehearsed testimonies about how happy they were in their jungle paradise. But the illusion cracked when members slipped notes to Ryan, begging him to take them away. When Jones realized what was happening, his mood darkened. The next day, as Ryan and a small group of defectors prepared to leave from the airstrip, Jones gave the order. His armed guards ambushed them, opening fire on the group. Ryan was shot more than 20 times, his body riddled with bullets. Journalists and defectors were gunned down in the chaos, the lucky ones running for cover into the surrounding jungle. With Ryan dead, Jones knew there was no turning back. The US government would come. His time was up. Back at the compound, Jones gathered his people for one final sermon. His voice, usually so controlled, now trembled with urgency. He told them the enemy was coming. He told them they had no escape. He told them the only way to win was to die. Large metal vats were filled with cyanide, Valium, and Flavor Aid. Mothers syringed the poison into their babies' mouths, their tiny bodies convulsing, eyes rolling back as they choked on the bitter death forced upon them. Parents wailed in agony as they gave the poison to their children, watching them collapse before drinking it themselves. Those who hesitated were forced to drink, held down, injected if necessary. Panic erupted. Some tried to flee, only to be chased down by guards. Others begged for their lives, sobbing as they were dragged toward their death. Some accepted it, lying down quietly as the poison burned through their veins. Within minutes, bodies littered the ground. Men, women, infants, elders, families who had believed in a dream only to be led to slaughter. Jones did not drink the poison. He took the coward's way out, sitting back and putting a bullet through his own head. When authorities arrived the next day, they were met with a nightmare unlike any other. Over 900 bodies, stacked and scattered across the ground, bloated from the heat, their skin already darkened with decay. The silence was deafening, the jungle eerily still. Jonestown was a monument to blind faith, manipulation, and absolute power run amok. It was proof of how one man could control the minds of hundreds, convince them to kill their own children, to smile as they swallowed death. Even now, the land where Jonestown once stood is said to be haunted. Those who have visited report hearing whispers in the wind, the faint sound of crying babies, the echoes of Jim Jones's final sermon drifting through the trees. Some say the dead are still there, trapped, unable to leave the paradise that became their grave. The People's Temple began with a promise of hope. It ended in a nightmare. The name Jonestown will forever be synonymous with one of the darkest tragedies in human history. A chilling reminder that the most terrifying monsters are not the ones lurking in the shadows, but the ones who stand in the light, promising salvation. The house at 18341 Colina Norte stood undisturbed in the wealthy suburb of Rancho Santa Fe, California. From the outside, it looked like any other luxurious home, a place of comfort and security, nestled among palm trees and gated estates. But behind its pristine exterior, something unthinkable was happening. For 3 days, in a meticulously orchestrated ritual, 39 people methodically ended their own lives, believing they were leaving Earth behind forever. When police finally entered the mansion on March 26, 1997, the house was silent, but the horror inside spoke for itself. The smell of death hung heavy in the air. The officers moved cautiously through the entryway, the oppressive stench growing stronger with each step. When they entered the first bedroom, they froze. Laid out in perfect rows were dozens of bodies, dressed identically in black sweatpants and oversized black shirts, their feet encased in brand new Nike Decades sneakers. Each one lay neatly on their beds, faces covered with carefully folded purple shrouds. Some still had plastic bags tied tightly around their heads, remnants of the final step taken to ensure they would never wake up. The scene was eerily orderly. No signs of struggle, no frantic attempts to escape. Just pure, absolute obedience. What the police had just uncovered was one of the largest mass suicides in modern history, a monument to the terrifying power of cult mentality. At the center of it all was one man, Marshall Applewhite, the leader of Heaven's Gate, the man who had convinced them all to abandon their human forms in search of salvation beyond the stars. Applewhite had spent more than 2 decades building his following, stripping his members of their individuality, their pasts, their very sense of self. He told them they were not truly human, that their bodies were nothing more than vehicles, temporary shells meant to be discarded when the time came. He spoke with calm, hypnotic certainty, his piercing eyes locking onto his followers with an intensity that made questioning him feel like a sin. They believed him. For years, Heaven's Gate had been waiting for a sign, an indication that their time on Earth was coming to an end. That sign, Applewhite claimed, arrived in 1996 when astronomers discovered the Hale-Bopp comet. To the world, Hale-Bopp was a celestial marvel, a rare and brilliant comet passing through Earth's skies. But to Applewhite, it was something far greater. He became obsessed, claiming that a spaceship was hidden behind the comet, invisible to human detection. This spaceship, he told his followers, was their ride to the next level, the kingdom of heaven. But there was a catch. It would not stop for them. They had to leave their human bodies behind to reach it. In other words, they had to die. And so the preparations began. For weeks, the cult worked in absolute secrecy, finalizing every detail of their departure. They recorded farewell videos, eerie messages filled with unsettling joy, in which each member smiled and spoke excitedly about leaving Earth behind. They weren't afraid, they welcomed their fate. They chose uniform black clothing, symbolizing their unity. They each carried a $5 bill and 3 quarters in their pockets, a symbolic toll for their cosmic journey. Their suitcases were packed and neatly placed beside their beds, as if they truly believed they would need belongings in the afterlife. Then, on March 24th, 1997, they began to die. The suicides were staggered, conducted in carefully planned waves over the course of 3 days. The first group prepared the poison, a lethal cocktail of phenobarbital, vodka, and pudding or applesauce to mask the bitterness. They ingested the mixture, lay down on their beds, and waited for the darkness to take them. As their bodies shut down, they placed plastic bags over their heads, ensuring that even if the poison didn't work fast enough, suffocation would finish the job. Those who remained removed the plastic bags, adjusted the bodies, and draped the purple shrouds over their faces before preparing their own poison. Wave after wave, the process repeated. For 3 days, they watched their friends die, saw their faces go pale, their bodies stiffen, their breath stop. And yet, none of them hesitated. They believed, with every ounce of their being, that they were about to wake up on a spaceship. Applewhite himself died last. His body was found on a separate bed, his eyes half open, mouth slightly parted, as if caught mid-thought. The shepherd had led his flock into oblivion, following them into the void. By the time the final member took their dose, the house had become a tomb, silent except for the faint hum of electricity still running through the walls. No one noticed at first. The world carried on, unaware of the unspeakable horror that lay behind the mansion's walls. It wasn't until an anonymous tip, a message left behind by a former member who had been spared, that authorities arrived to discover the chilling aftermath. As investigators combed through the house, they found more than just bodies. They found evidence of years of brainwashing, manipulation, and absolute control. They found journals filled with Applewhite's teachings, bizarre ramblings about aliens, ascension, and the destruction of Earth. They found videotaped confessions where members expressed their joy at dying, their unwavering faith in Applewhite's promise. They found a website, Still Live, still recruiting. Even now, the Heaven's Gate website remains active, maintained by former members who were spared from the mass suicide. To this day, they still believe. They still wait for the next sign. They still expect the spaceship to return. The Heaven's Gate mass suicide was not just a tragedy. It was a demonstration of the terrifying power of faith gone wrong. It was the proof that a single man, with the right words and enough control, could convince dozens of people to surrender their lives without a fight. There was no panic in that house. No one ran. No one begged for their life. They lay down, smiling, believing they had found the key to eternal life. But when the police entered that house, there were no souls lifted to the heavens, no ascension, no spaceship waiting in the sky. There was only death. And perhaps somewhere out there, those lost souls still drift through the darkness of space, searching for the ship that never came. Deep in the remote Canadian wilderness, far from the eyes of civilization, a nightmare unfolded. A nightmare crafted by the hands of one man. His name was Roche Theriot, and under his rule, a small group of devoted followers suffered unspeakable horrors. They had once believed in his vision, believed that he was a prophet, a divine messenger who would lead them to salvation. But what he led them into was a world of torture, mutilation, and death. A world that would one day become known as one of the most depraved cults in history, the Anthill Kids. Roche Theriot was not always a monster. In the beginning, he was simply a man with a gift for persuasion, someone who could make even the most rational person question their beliefs. Born in 1947 in Quebec, Canada, he was raised in a strict Catholic household. But by his teenage years, he had begun to reject traditional religion in favor of his own twisted interpretations of spirituality. He became obsessed with the idea that the world was on the brink of apocalyptic destruction, that only a select few would be saved. He would later claim that he alone had been chosen by God to lead his followers into the new world. By the late 1970s, Theriot had gathered a loyal group of believers, mostly young women searching for purpose, men who had lost direction, and the vulnerable who found comfort in his words. He promised them a utopia, a self-sufficient commune free from the corruption of modern society. Together, they retreated into the wilderness of Burnt River, Ontario, where they built their own settlement, farming their own food, making their own clothes, and living completely cut off from the outside world. He called them the Anthill Kids, telling them that like ants, they must work tirelessly, never question their purpose, and devote themselves fully to the survival of the group. At first, life in the commune seemed simple, even peaceful, but something dark began to fester. Theriot's power over his followers grew unchecked, and he descended into madness. He declared himself God incarnate, demanding absolute obedience. He told them that he alone had the power to heal, to punish, and to decide who lived and who died. Those who disobeyed were subjected to punishments so brutal, so inhuman, that it is difficult to believe such suffering was real. What began as verbal abuse quickly turned into physical violence. He would beat his followers for the smallest infractions, starve them, force them to sit naked in freezing temperatures for hours. But even that was not enough. Soon, he forced them to mutilate themselves as punishment. If someone displeased him, he would order them to smash their own fingers with a hammer. Others were told to pull out their own teeth with pliers, to cut off toes with a knife, to burn themselves to prove their devotion. No one was spared. Theriault's delusions of grandeur led him to believe that he had the power to heal through surgery, even though he had no medical training, no equipment, nothing but a perverse desire to cause pain. If a follower fell ill, he would not seek medicine or treatment. Instead, he would cut them open with a kitchen knife, dig around inside their bodies with his bare hands, and claim he was removing the sickness. One of the most horrific acts he committed was against Solange Boislard, one of his most devoted followers. One night, she complained of stomach pain. Theriault, convinced that he could cure her, forced her onto a table, took a knife, and sliced open her abdomen. He reached inside, pulling out parts of her intestines with no anesthesia, no antiseptic, nothing but his own twisted belief that this was divine intervention. She died hours later, in agony, surrounded by the very people who had once called themselves her family. Even then, Theriault refused to accept that she was dead. He ordered his followers to carry out a ritual, believing that through his divine power, he could resurrect her. He had them drill a hole into her skull, filling it with a mixture of oil and vinegar, while others took turns masturbating onto her corpse, a horrifying act he insisted would restore her life. But she never woke up. Her body was burned, her death was erased, and the cult continued. The women in the commune were not only subjected to violence, they were breeding stock. Theriault impregnated many of them, believing that his children were divine beings, that they would one day rule the new world. But the children were not spared his cruelty. One 2-year-old boy, the son of one of the cult members, suffered one of the worst fates. When the child refused to obey him, Theriault decided he needed to be disciplined. He tied him to a tree and left him outside overnight in the freezing cold. The next morning, the child was dead, frozen solid, his tiny body blue and lifeless. Even then, no one resisted. No one ran. No one fought back. They had been broken beyond repair. For years, the cult remained hidden, buried in the wilderness where no one could see the horrors that unfolded inside. The authorities had no idea what was happening. No reports, no missing persons, nothing. But in 1989, one woman finally escaped. Her name was Gabrielle Lavallee, and she had endured years of torment, including the amputation of her own arm at Theriault's hands. She had been conditioned to believe she was nothing without him, but something inside her snapped. One night, she ran. She ran through the trees, ran until she reached civilization, ran until she found someone who would listen. When she told the police what had happened inside the commune, they could not believe it was real. When authorities finally raided the compound, the scene was worse than anyone had imagined. The surviving members were malnourished, covered in bruises, too broken to speak. Bodies had been burned and buried, evidence of horrors that would never fully be uncovered. The children, wide-eyed and silent, had never known a world beyond pain. Theriault was arrested and sentenced to life in prison. Even behind bars, he remained delusional, believing that he had done nothing wrong. He still called himself a prophet, still insisted that he was carrying out God's will. But in 2011, his reign of terror finally ended. Another inmate, sickened by the stories of what he had done, murdered him in his cell, stabbing him in the neck with a homemade shank. It was a death he never saw coming, a fitting end for a man who had inflicted so much suffering upon the innocent. The land where the Ant-Hill kids once lived now sits abandoned, swallowed by time. But some say the ghosts of those who suffered there still linger. Locals report strange sounds at night, faint screams that have no source, whispers on the wind, the echoes of torment long past. The Anthill Kids were not just a cult. They were a horrific testament to the depths of human depravity, a story so disturbing that even those who study cult psychology struggle to comprehend it. And though Theriot is gone, the scars he left behind will never truly fade. Thank you for watching this video by Sanctum Obscura. If you enjoyed unraveling the darkness with us, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Stay curious, stay brave, and remember, some mysteries are better left in the shadows. See you next time.